Next up this week, Game Pass. It's coming under fire again, and this time the call is coming from inside the house. At least, sort of. It's from former occupants of the house who've since moved out. But there's a few quotes this week, hot on the heels of former Bethesda executive Pete Hines questioning Game Pass as a business strategy in an interview he did this past week, and I think his first one since he retired a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. Another former Microsoft executive has backed Pete's comments, insisting Microsoft's subscription service creates, quote, weird inner tensions. So this past week, Pete Hines, who was the VP of marketing and comms at Bethesda, he said gaming subscription services like Game Pass, quote, are worth jack shit if the game developers who create content for them are not properly supported. And boy, could I not agree more with taking care of creators, for sure. He says, subscriptions have become the new 4-letter word, right? You can't buy a product anymore. When you talk about a subscription that relies on content, if you don't figure out how to balance the needs of the service and the people running the service with the people who are providing the content, without which your subscription is worth jack shit, then you have a real problem, end quote. And then, over on LinkedIn, former PlayStation executive Shawn Layden expressed support for Hines' comment, saying it, quote, hits this nail right on the head. He says, the question is not, is the service profitable for the platform? He added, is it healthy and helpful for the developer is what we need to ask, end quote. Layden's comment prompted a comment from former Xbox Game Studios Vice President Shannon Loftis, who provided some insight that benefits from coming from a former Microsoft employee. So Loftis, who retired from Microsoft in 2022 after 29 years at the company, served as a manager on several Xbox projects, including Fable, Viva Pinata, Banjo-Kazooie, and Age of Empires. She said, quote, as a longtime first-party Xbox developer, I can attest that Pete is correct. While Game Pass can claim a few victories with games that otherwise would have sunk beneath the waves, the majority of game adoption on Game Pass comes at the expense of retail revenue, unless the game is engineered from the ground up for post-release monetization. I could, and may someday, write pages on the weird inner tensions this creates, end quote. So, quite the little industry conversation there. Michael, your thoughts?
You know, it's funny for us to have these conversations because it feels like from the outside looking in, we're not privy to a lot of the information about the business and how money is distributed. But someone like Pete Hines definitely is. And for him to come out and say something so boldly is like, oh, like we should probably pay attention to that and not just take his word for it, but account for it when we think about how Game Pass defines success and how developers themselves define success within Game Pass. I know that, you know, we've heard stories about how certain games, smaller size games, wouldn't have been possible without being part of Game Pass and finding an audience there. I know like Fallout 76 got a second win through Game Pass, and something like Pentiment is been made possible by Game Pass, or at least on account of what Josh Sawyer said in the past. But as a streaming service, on like when you account for it as a streaming service, it has to be sustainable. And when you're cutting business deals left and right, people get lost in some people get left out when others win. And I think that that's just like the nature of a subscription-based service. For the wrong reasons, something like Spotify finds success because the way they exploit artists. Obviously, I wish it wasn't that way, of course, but I think that I don't want to say like an even playing field where everybody gets basically nothing. But there isn't necessarily like the way they tier who gets what from number of streams. Of course, Spotify cuts deals for podcasts, of course, and that's like a separate thing that tends to be a public sort of deal. But with Game Pass being a subscription model, like, again, they're talking about, is this sustainable for developers to keep feeding into it? Because it also has to do with customer expectations, where if you subscribe to something, you expect new things to keep coming into it. Otherwise, why would you subscribe? And of course, with music, it's a little different because artists are going to be making music all the time. But with games, it's just like it's such a different beast. And the way the internal studios can pump these things out is like a really kind of a shitty way to put it as well. It's just such a wild dynamic to handle. And for a high level executive to look at it and be like, hey, it may have been like great at some point, but this is not sustainable and people are going to get lost in the process. And like, we have already seen this in some form with layoffs across Microsoft. Like it hasn't been like the golden parachute, or it hasn't been like the catch-all solution to sustaining development. And if anything, it kind of, as much as gamers can enjoy something like a Game Pass, there are things in which it needs to figure out as a business to keep existing in a way that makes sense for both the people who make the games and Xbox as a business.
Kai, you've been on multiple sides of the industry as content creation / media, also on the dev side. What do you make of Game Pass, these comments from Pete Hines and Shawn Layden and Shannon Loftis?
I mean, I take Pete and Shannon's word because they've been in the trenches alongside folks like Shawn, who have been doing it when he was working at PlayStation on the PlayStation side. I think especially Shawn's really interesting because, and I don't know Shannon's full scope of work, right? Like I know what she was tasked to do, but I know Shawn was basically like a head biz dev layer of that part of the company in some of the forms of fashions of what's he worked. Pete has always been a straight shooter. We've had many conversations with him over the years. Every time I've talked to him personally, he's always been fantastic and amazing to be able to like get the real skinny on where things are kind of at. So when he's saying things like this, it does raise my eyebrows a little bit more to be able to say, like you said, Michael, that those conversations have some more merit and worth as opposed to the usual folks that we see just talking about stuff on the internet.
Mm-hmm.
What comes across to me when you see these discussions happen is a bunch of different versions of talking points where, one, I think what we're seeing in these discussions is that Game Pass is not the one size fits all solution for every developer.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like that was the thing that if you were paying attention to the space that you would have already been able to have pulled down and been like, well, yeah, if you're making a much smaller game as an indie studio and you're looking for visibility as your first title out of the gate and you need financial stability, Game Pass could be a potential avenue for that.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a much larger organization and you had a couple of games in the hopper and games that have already come out, that may be a very different discussion for you in the way that you then look at how you want to approach the publishing deal that you're going into. What I do understand from having conversations and having some of the small discussions, because I've never been in a biz dev role, I've never signed a deal in those ways, is that no one at this point is finding surprises in the way that these contracts are being built, unless you were new, right? If you're young, if you're new to the space, that may be a space where you're looking and saying, well, oh, my want is to make as much money as possible, which is the want from every developer who's making a game. You want to make as much money that you can make revenue on your product. Do you get that upfront money? Do you get that on the back end by just hoping that you're going to get revenue from the game sales? That's a discussion that has been had for the existence of video game production, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what I come back to is say, are those we're not in a space where Game Pass is mandatory from what I've heard from any developer who's joining the service or joining the process. So you can't necessarily say that Xbox is a big bad demon in the way that it's like it's predatory in those ways. I don't believe it is. Unless, again, we've heard from probably maybe in the time that Game Pass has existed, we've seen maybe a handful of folks who have been behind the scenes who are no longer behind the scenes bring up these points of conjecture for it. And we've not seen that many developers come out against Game Pass as a process, right? We're still fairly new in the whole process of making Game Pass a service. And we still haven't proven out if it's bad or good, if it's had a net negative or net positive in the ways that it has. So I think these are really good and smart people who are talking about the process from having seen it, from having that future facing understanding of the way the industry works and understanding how things are moving. But also, we wind up kind of over indexing on some of these moments because none of us can call it. Michael framed it perfectly by being like, we're not in the back rooms making those deals and making those conversations happen. So I would prefer to hear, because again, I rock with Pete and I rock with Shannon's assessments here because I know that they know what they're talking about. But if it was really that big of an issue or a problem right now, I think we would have seen much more of an uproar from the development community saying, this is not working for us.
Yeah.
And this is not actually benefiting us in the ways that we need to make the games that we want. The other kind of slice of this really quickly that I've seen as a zeitgeist conversation is the feeling or the understanding from the gaming community, because I think that's also a very important layer of this, is that now Game Pass games have less quality just by being associated with it or being in the service, which I think is a false accusation and a false equivalency that people are pulling together. Yes, the layoffs have happened. We've seen it with Hi-Fi Rush, and we've seen it with other couple of companies in that space. But there's this really weird correlation that people are trying to make where in Pete, I don't think Pete necessarily alluded to it. He did allude to the idea of like, what happens if we continue to go down this road and we continue to ask developers to change their kind of vision for what this is. And I don't want to misquote Pete, and I don't want to add other layers to that conversation that aren't directly him. But I think that's a layer of this conversation that's kind of permeating from this discussion that we've seen. Mm-hmm. And I think, again, nobody knows unless you've worked in a studio, unless you've been in that publisher's room and you've written your name on that contract and said, I'm signing my life away to make this amount of game for this amount of money. So I think it's a good moment to be able to reconvene and say, so what does this mean for the greater culture, for the greater industry? And if it does feel like it's starting to get into spaces that are not beneficial for folks. But there are also a ton of other things that are happening in the space that are not beneficial for development. And it speaks to a lot of different parts of the way that Game Pass, because of that moment of, well, you're dipping in and dipping out of games because as a consumer, I'm dipping in and out of games and maybe not consuming them in the full ways that I would have because I don't own it. And because there's multiple things on that space for me to consume. That's a player behavior layer that we're not also discussing, right? That's not a thing that you can really build for if you're a game developer. You're just trying to get your game in front of as many people as you possibly can, while also giving them the best experience that you can for the understanding of like, we need longevity as a studio to continue to make the things we want to make. So it is a way more nuanced conversation, and I think a lot of folks are making it. And I'm happy we're discussing it now because we get to then, through your platform, have those discussions and have that outreach to say, hey, developers, come on the show and talk to us about what that process looks like for you. What does it mean for you to be included in this? And are you seeing from your developer friends and other people in your space, your peers, this same notion kind of permeate? Because that's where it winds up coming to fruition at the end of the day.
Yeah, you're making me want to put together a GDC panel for next year. Mm-hmm. To try and get like an indie developer, smaller indie developer, maybe like a mid-size AA kind of size developer and a bigger AAA developer to have this exact conversation. Cause I think you both really nailed it in the sense that we just don't have enough real information to draw any firm conclusions from any of this. Again, it's not discounting Shannon, Pete, or Shawn at all here. Quite the opposite. It's just we need to hear from more developers. But Kai, I think you made a great point about if things were grim, if Game Pass were really a significant detriment in a real core way, we probably would have heard something about that by now. But I think part of it is not only the lack of real clarity on the sort of Wizard of Oz behind the curtain side of it, but also that obviously I won't say no to Game Pass deals are alike, but not every developer is signing the same deal. Right. They're not all signing the same arrangement. Like, the Back for Blood team, Turtle Rock with their publisher WB is not signing the same Game Pass day one deal, which they did, as Team Cherry is for Silksong.
Mhm.
As
1,000%.
Sony San Diego and Sony are with MLB for not this year, but MLB The Show. Those first few years it came to Xbox. Like, these terms are all clearly different.
They have to be, because every studio has different needs,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
And you have different wants from whatever that financial support is going to wind up being. We don't know how much of that is going to be, again, like, well, how much of that is marketing towards your game? We know that, you know, they have a number of eyes that they have to project how many people are going to see your game once you go into Game Pass. Like that's a known factor, right? But if I'm a studio who's making something like Abubakar Salim, like their game that they were making, you know, the stuff that they're making is much smaller, but has a much bigger impact because, oh, this amount of people have seen my stuff. South of Midnight, from a well-known studio that has made a couple of games, has already lived on Xbox. I'm sure that they are like, oh, well, this game is a little bit more arty. This game, depending upon the content that we're making, may not see a much bigger audience than this particular part of the what they call the TAM, the total addressable market. How do we affect being able to potentially see all of those people and potentially have them pay for our game, which you can still do in Game Pass? This whole other part of it is weird too, where people making this idea of like, you can't own a thing. You can buy the game outright.
And you don't at a discount, by the way. If it's on Game Pass, you actually get a discount for actually buying it outright.
Yeah, so like that part of the conversation I see often, and I'm like, that's not real. That's not actually right. So I think there's some misconceptions and people misconstruing the way that it works, because to a certain extent, we're not supposed to know publisher deals in that way. This is new information of the new part of the generation that we have now become a part of as media people in the game space, where there's an expectation to know every single thing about every part of the funnel. And some of those things we're going to know, and some of those things we're just not going to know. So I think that's not a bad thing in the grand scheme either. Like, what are you going to do with that information? All right, kid at home who just got their game, like, tell me about this publishing deal and tell me how that affects the way you play this thing. How many achievements are in that publishing deal that you just played? No one actually cares.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting the way they're kind of talking about it.
Yeah. I think also that when more and more people who are close to the process speak out about some of their concerns or the things that they've seen, it doesn't always make anyone less right or more wrong. And in a way, it's like it is additional information to this very complex puzzle. So like whatever Pete Hines shares is an important piece to understanding Game Pass from the outside. Whatever internal developers currently working on something say about it, or like all these people involved with it who have different experiences with it, it feels like a lot of those are just valid pieces to kind of get this really weird amalgamation of like what the subscription service is. It's so, and like you said, it is a fairly new thing that is adjusting on the fly, and you know, all these deals are different. So, and we've talked about in the past too, in the previous episode, that the question about whether or not Game Pass is profitable is like, we already know that it is, and it is extremely profitable. And then I think the thing that as time goes on, we'll figure out is like, how is that profit being distributed and shared, and how is it being used to create a sustainable platform for multiple developers? Like, that's the thing that we're trying to figure out.
Last quick point, I think bouncing off of that is, I think the biggest layer of all of these conversations is knowing where Microsoft has moved as a company. We know that the hockey stick has to go up, right? And if that's the case, and if that feels like, and is actually, again, detrimental to the way that games are being made, when you've hit a certain level where you're like, we are making so much money that it doesn't matter, and now we're seeing a dip in potential ability to make the games that you want, that's when I think the red flags should really start to pop up. And that's when you need to start asking some bigger questions about like, so is this actually being a helpful space for the development community? So,
yeah. And I'll just add, I can't remember if this was an on the record conversation I had or off. So I'll keep it vague, but there was an IGN Unfiltered guest that I had in the studio a long time ago now. This is definitely earlier days of Game Pass. And their game was on multiple platforms, but also on Game Pass. And I had asked him, well, so how is this working for you? And again, this is a long time ago, so maybe it's not even really relevant given, as you said, how much Microsoft has changed
Yeah.
and their sort of business strategy has changed in over even just the last like 2 years. But at the time, this developer had said, yeah, we saw an uptick in sales on other platforms as a result of being on Game Pass because people would try it and then they would like double dip on it on another platform they owned or recommend it to a friend or whatever. So, and again, and that's one type of Game Pass deal for one type of developer. So I'm not trying to say that that's how it is for every game, every developer, every publisher that puts their game on Game Pass, but there's a lot of just lack of public clarity. Like you said, Kods, we've never historically known the ins and outs of these contracts and how these business deals are made. But Game Pass itself is so public facing that it's now, I think, created a little bit of tension between maybe the gaming community and their relationship to something like a Game Pass, because we all want to see developers thrive, right? We want to see developers be able to make a good living, not have to kill themselves to get every single game done, and be able to continue making the art that we're all lucky enough to get to enjoy from them. So, yeah, I definitely think part of this might be on Microsoft too. I'm not saying just like open the foot locker up to show exactly how everything gets done, but maybe there's a way to message how Game Pass works better that Microsoft's not doing.
And I think really quickly, because I know we have to pivot, but I think this also potentially can be a Pandora's box for developers too, where it goes back to the Forza conversation of like, we are having people troll for every morsel of information that they can glom onto, often regurgitating bad versions of them that are not actually based in fact or actual real life realism that we live in. If we start to say, hey, we want you to open up the process for us so that we have a better understanding of what that looks like, where's the boundary for that makes sense for the people who are asking for it? Because if I tell you said game got 50 million up front to be able to be made, or at least to continue production or whatever it may be, there's a new expectation from the consumer and the customer for a different level of quality that they don't have an understanding of. And that then could potentially be a backfire towards those folks if the game isn't up to expectations, if the game is not meeting whatever standard that the consumer has made for themselves. And then that doesn't even talk about the internet zeitgeist of how people use misinformation or don't understand how game development works.
True.
So again, I think there's a space there where we ask for a lot without understanding the repercussions of what some of that may be, while also being like, we want everyone to thrive. We want everyone to do better. We want the space to be safer for those folks. But sometimes all the information isn't good information to be able to have out into the world and be able to absorb. So I think once you have people who are subject matter experts, be able to speak to those languages and speak to those numbers and speak to what that means, folks like Shannon, folks like Pete, then you have a better understanding. I want more conversations from them. Speak more about the process that you've seen over the time that you've done it. And I think he's done it in that article and talked about the way that his career has changed and the way that he's looked at development and the way he's looked at the studio that he used to work for. A lot of those conversations just make a lot of sense once you have more context and more people who actually know, as opposed to people who are pontificating about what the process might be.
Yeah, great point. And maybe there's like a more vague way to do it on maybe it's like just to use a current hot example, like even though they clearly didn't need the quote unquote help from Game Pass, but Team Cherry, maybe it's Team Cherry comes out and says, oh, for those in our community curious about our relationship with Microsoft and Game Pass, well, they funded our, this series of milestones or something that helped ensure that our developers could do what they need to do without crunching or on a keep a certain schedule or whatever. Maybe there's some number free way to do that in a little bit less of a Pandora's boxy way. Or maybe you're right entirely and it's a Pandora's box no matter what. And it's just, maybe this is the best version of it. This sort of vague scenario that we find ourselves in now. I don't know. Oh man. Let's end here with this last thing. And it's about it's actually a developer right not too far from me that's getting ready to ship a game on Game Pass. Double Fine. Thanks for checking out this clip from Unlocked, IGN's weekly Xbox show. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to watch the full episode at youtube.com/IGN Games. New episodes of Unlocked drop every Thursday on IGN Games, IGN.com, and your favorite podcast platforms. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.